Welcome to the fifth and final tutorial on the components of synthesizers, and we've left the hardest one till last. LFOs, low frequency oscillators. So I'll just scroll forward to the page in our PowerPoint of our Moodle to LFOs, and reading through it we can see a low frequency oscillator, LFO, generates an electronic signal often below the hearing range of 20 Hz. So we know that an oscillator or an oscillation of a waveform is one complete cycle. So an LFO, low frequency, means not that many cycles per second. In fact, under 20 Hz would be 20 cycles or oscillations per second. Now what that oscillator does, it sends a control signal over to other parameters in the synthesizer and can create effects like tremolos, vibratos, wobbles, wah-wahs. It can be used to control the filter section. It can be used to control the mix between different oscillators, depending on the complexity of the synthesizer you're using. Now an LFO is a waveform. It has a rhythmic or periodic nature tied to the frequency being generated. This can be sped up or slowed down using the rate setting, which changes the frequency or how many oscillations per second. You can often set the type of waveform, and we're going to look at that operating in a few seconds on a Logic synth. In simple synths, the LFO is preset as to where it goes, but in more complex synths, it can be routed to control different functions. Okay, so I'll let you read through the rest of that and we'll get straight into it in Logic. So I've got the ES1 synthesizer here from the synth bank, ES1. And down here we can see the oscillator section. And I'm going to demonstrate this in the simplest way that I can figure out. What we can see here at the oscillator, can select different types of waveforms. So we've got our sawtooth waves, our triangle waves, or our square wave. And it's actually a really good way to learn what a square wave and these other shapes are all about. Now after the waveform, I've got the rate setting, and in this synth, if I'm over at free, you can see it gives me a rating, can go up to 24.5 Hertz. So that is my cycles per second. If I go over to sync, it will start to talk about synchronizing to the tempo of my project up here, tempo 80, and at the moment it would do quarter notes, or half notes, or whole notes, or eighth notes. If you see T there, that's eighth note triplets, and D is a dotted note. So I'm going to use the free, and I'm going to set a very slow cycle. I'm going to turn this up. Now this particular control in this synth, if I set this to external, then the oscillation would be controlled by the modulation wheel on my synth. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep it up at square wave. I'm going to give it the full effect here, and I'm going to make it control the pitch. So I've got a MIDI file written, and it's just at the moment triggering one note. And what we'll hear, because the low frequency oscillator is affecting pitch, we'll hear a high pitch and a low pitch. And there won't be anything in between. It'll just go high, low, high, low. Let's have a listen. I can speed the rate up, and you almost get a trill effect, or I can slow it right down. Now, as I said, this is a really good way to cement our understanding of these oscillation wave shapes, the square wave. For instance, if I go to this sawtooth wave, I should hear it ramp up or glide up to the pitch, and then drop straight down to the low pitch. Glide up, drop down. Let's have a listen. And then if I go the other direction, sawtooth, it'll go straight up to the pitch, slide down, straight up, slide down. The triangle wave will go evenly up and then down. Etc. Now the next control that I'm going to look at is the mix control. So I'm going to take this down to 0, and I'm going to play the file. And Effectively, what I'm going to be doing with my LFO is emulating that motion I just did, where I have the mix moving up between the top oscillator and the sub oscillator. So this, again, at the square wave, will just go purely top oscillator, bottom oscillator. This one is sliding from the bottom oscillator up to the top and down again, or vice versa. So we can see that in this case the LFO is being routed to the mix and controlling this. The next thing I can route my LFO to is the cutoff frequency. So again, if I play my track, and I'll take this down, it's the equivalent of doing this. Now let's let the LFO do it. Okay, and so as expected, if I have the resonance selected, then the LFO is affecting this control here. Now to hear this one properly, I need to have a bunch of small MIDI notes because the resonance factor only comes in at the attack of the notes. Now let's have a listen. And we can just hear very gently that the sharpness of the attack of that note increasing, in this case, as it goes up the waveform and then drops down to the start point and slides up again. Now the last setting we're going to have a look at here is volume. And what that's going to do is it's going to assign the action of the LFO over here to the volume control. So it's basically going to turn the volume up or down. So let's have a listen. And it becomes like a tremolo. Now the ES1 is quite sophisticated as a synthesizer, not nearly as difficult as it can get, but there is a second set of controllers here about the modulation envelope and a second set of routers here which says what will this control. Now I'm not going to get into this because it's beyond the scope of our basic understanding of LFOs. The next synth we're going to look at is the ESE. Here it is. And even though it doesn't say so, this section here is the LFO controller. But in the case of this synth, because it's quite a lot simpler as a synthesizer, I only have two controls, speed and vibrato, which is also PWM, pulse width modulation. That's how much the waveform is going to modulate in terms of pitch. So if I have it down, I won't hear any vibrato or wobble effect. And as I turn it up, so you can hear as I turn that up the amount of pitch that it covers between oscillating between the highest and lowest pitch increases. Then if I work with the speed, it will sound less zany and more like a vibrato or a trill. So we have here a vibrato control, which is actually an LFO, and that is connected to the waveform here and adjusting the pitch and the speed at which that pitch is adjusted. The next synth we're going to look at is the retro synth. And here we can see we've got a specific LFO area here. I have two controls, synchronization. So when synchronization is turned on and I adjust my rate here, over here at these numbers, you can see that at the moment it's going to adjust by 8th note T for triplet, 16th notes, 32 dotted, D is for dotted. So I can scroll through all these potential values and that will synchronize itself to the tempo of this project. If I take that to off, now the rate is being shown in terms of hertz. So I can take that down or take it up. You can see that I have various waveform shapes that I can choose for the type of waveform that the oscillation will be doing. This control here is again to do with synthesizers, how much the modulation wheel on a synthesizer will bring in this effect. Now in this case there's nowhere to assign this control, but if I look up here at the filter, I can assign it here. I can dial in how much of the LFO I want to have in the sound. I can slow it down. And as I bring this down, it has more effect over here. Now with the vibrato control, over here, I can see similarly over at the oscillator area of the synthesizer, I have an ability to dial in the vibrato. So I have the same series of controls and the same concept, and I can bring in amounts of vibrato. So I'll just take the LFO out of the picture, so we're not hearing any of this effect. And the vibrato is at the moment at 0. I'm going to bring my wheel control down so the control is all happening from here. So we can see again there's the same concept, the LFO oscillator is affecting this area here, but in terms of vibrato, because it's working with the pitch, and over here the LFO is assigned to the filter and can be dialed into the filter. So go have a look at a bunch of synthesizers and see if you can identify the LFO section, and as always have a look at some presets, and when you like a sound, go and deconstruct what's happening over at the oscillators, the filters, the amps, the LFOs, and the ADSR. So that wraps up our tutorial series on synthesizers, and what we're trying to gain from this is just an understanding about that basic functionality and what everything's doing. It's by no means going to turn you into an expert on how to use synthesizers. That's a whole field of mastery in itself. But what it will do is when you've pulled up a sound that you like and you feel like you need to just adjust it a little bit just to get it perfectly the way you imagine, you should be able to go into some of the controls and have a pretty good feel for how you might adjust that sound just to get it exactly the way you want it. Thanks for tuning in.